Hey, welcome to our little interview session. So we decided to do something a little bit different. We're going through the book of First Peter, and it's called the Counterintuitive Life. And so then we get to First Peter chapter 3, and it's a passage all about marriage. And so instead of doing this on a Sunday morning where we've got kids around and singles and so forth, we decided to do this a little bit differently in an interview format and look at First Peter in that way. And so in a little kind of twist and family fun, I asked my daughter Emily to interview us because she's had a front row seat to our marriage in the good, the bad, and the ugly of it over the last 20 plus years. So I'm going to hand it over to Emily. Take it away.
So I'm Emily. I am the oldest of the ever-expanding Stanton family. So I've been watching this marriage in some capacity for 23 years. And I really have just gotten to learn a lot just from observing their marriage, but then also getting to have conversations like this, just talking through it. So I am really excited for this interview and just to get to soak up some wisdom that they have on this passage of the Bible. And as I was preparing, I was just, you're starting to cry, goodness. You're going to make me cry. Okay,
Gosh, we got
get ready for it.
90 seconds in, the tears flow.
But as I was preparing for this, I was just thinking about what is something that I get to see just as their kid and observing their marriage. And the really big thing that stands out to me is just every day growing up, for about 5:30, I got to see them sit on the couch and just share life together. Goodness, Mom. Share life together, and my dad rubbed my mom's feet, and just getting to see that companionship and friendship has really been cool. So just to get us started, I think a lot of people know you as Matt and Stacy individually, and so just some questions about who you are together. So just real briefly, talk us through how you all met, when you started dating, all that good stuff that brought you up to today.
So Matt and I do not have I guess a real typical boy meets girl, high school sweetheart kind of relationship, but we actually met when we had just finished our senior year of high school, and we were both working at a Young Life camp in Colorado. And from that time, I would say we became great friends and really respected one another, and became pen pals. So I went to college in Texas, and Matt went to college in Connecticut. And this was truly before even email, no cell phones. So anyway, we wrote letters to one another back and forth for 4 years. So
Yep.
You want to hit from there?
And then, so my senior year of college, I went to visit Stacy. I was on my way to California to play in a team tennis kind of deal. And I stopped in Texas for, I guess it was probably 4 or 5 days. And we got to know each other and really hit it off. And then that's where the storyline differs. I thought that I left there and we were dating, but apparently we weren't. And we actually apparently didn't start dating in Stacy's mind until June, but we've worked through that for the most part. But then after college, I lived in Cincinnati for a year and then Cleveland for a year, and Stacy was getting her master's in Texas for that whole time. And so that was long distance dating. And then and that summer after she finished her master's, she moved up to Cleveland, lived with some girls, and then we got married in December. And so that was kind of the beginning of our relationship.
Yeah. And then fast forward, how many years? How long have you been married? 20-something?
27 years.
27 years. So fast forward 27 years. Like, where would you say your marriage is right now in this season?
Well, we thought we were heading towards empty nesting, but got a different plan. So where we are, I guess, as a couple is just really enjoying kind of companionship. And not that we're out of the weeds and raising our kids, but we're at a place where we really enjoy our relationship with our kids. It's a little less parenting maybe and more almost adult friendship. And when Emily made a joke about our expanding family, we now have 2 foster boys that are living with us, one who is 8, Tristan, and one who is 17, Roman. And so that has kind of kicked us back into full throttle parenting. So
Yeah. So I think our marriage is probably stronger than it's ever been, and I would say more enjoyable than it's ever been. Or actually, I would say that it was more enjoyable than it's ever been like 8 weeks ago. And in the last couple weeks, or the last 6 weeks, have been actually caused some sort of new kind of challenges to our relationship, and we can talk about that a little bit later. But
Yeah.
So
What's your favorite part about your relationship or your dynamic as a couple? Either now or
I would say for me, really companionship, and I would say that we're on the same page with a lot of things. Not that makes marriage easier necessarily, but I think the idea of just being united in spirit and in purpose, like Paul talks about, is really what I would use to define our marriage.
Yeah, and I would say that we, like, kind of early on, we said it a few times, like in our first year or two, like let's get all of our fighting out of the way in the first couple of years of marriage, so that the rest of it can be enjoyable. And so we don't really squabble about small things or little things.
Did that strategy work then?
I think so.
It's actually a biblical idea, so maybe.
Yeah. I mean, we still have disagreements and stuff. We have to talk through things, but we don't really nitpick on the little things because we've kind of figured out what the other one likes. And so right now we're just in a kind of a sweet spot with our marriage of it's really life-giving, and we understand the other person and kind of how they work and how we can work best together.
Yeah. Then the flip side of that, like, what has been hard about your relationship? Again, either as a whole or this season.
This season?
Yeah, this season in the last few weeks.
Well, this season we'll let the people remain nameless. But no, I would say probably the hardest part of our marriage has probably actually been the parenting side of things. Mm-hmm. That there's been times when we haven't been on the same page of parenting, and that's been hard. And the hard side of that is like we butt heads. But I think the good side of that, when we can see it, is that we balance each other out. That I tend to be a little bit more fun and grace-giving and flexible and those types of things. And I think Stacy tends to be more like, okay, we need to think about the well-being of this child and not just having fun today.
Yeah.
Is that a good way to put it?
Yeah, and I would agree with you as far as that being kind of the biggest struggle right now for us.
Yeah. And we'll get more into that. I mean, there's a few questions about parenting. So, so I'm going to start reading 1 Peter. So kind of where we'll be focusing on for the rest of this interview is 1 Peter 3. So I'm going to read the first 7 verses. Likewise, wives, be subject to your own husbands, so that even if some do not obey the word, they may be won without a word by the conduct of their wives, when they see your respectful and pure conduct. Do not let your adorning be external, the braiding of hair and the putting on of gold jewelry, or in the clothing you wear, but let your adorning be the hidden person of the heart with the imperishable beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit, which in God's sight is very precious. For this is how the holy women who hoped in God used to adorn themselves, by submitting to their own husbands, as Sarah obeyed Abraham, calling him Lord. And you are her children if you do good and do not fear anything that is frightening. Likewise, husbands, live with your wives in an understanding way, showing honor to the woman as the weaker vessel, since they are heirs with you of the grace of life, so that your prayers may not be hindered. So right away in this passage, I think that there are things that maybe rub people, especially women, the wrong way. The idea of submitting or subjecting and all of that. So Mom, like, what is your response to that? How does that sit with you?
I would say that I wrestled through that probably more in the beginning of our marriage. But I always link that verse back to Ephesians, where it talks to submitting ourselves to one another out of reverence for Christ. And so when I see being subject, or when I see being submissive, I see that my first priority is that I am submissive to Christ, or I am subject to Christ's authority. And so, and I think the promise in this verse, it's such a higher calling, but it comes with such a greater purpose, is if your husbands don't believe, or your version says obey the word, that they might be won over without words by the behavior of their wives when they see the purity and reverence of your lives. And I see that as being so purposeful in serving Matt, submitting to Matt. And this is not an easy call, really, in the dailiness of life. I think that's where it kind of fleshes itself out. And the only way that we really can be submissive out of reverence to Christ and our husband is by this daily filling of Christ in me. And I see that as really being his vessel through which he can pour out his love on Matt. And I am surrounded by women who maybe at this point in their lives, they've kind of latched on to Jesus more so than when they were first married, and are really flourishing in their relationship with Christ. And maybe their husband is not at that same place yet. So I look at this scripture and kind of the call and the promise, and I realize that if we live our lives in front of our husbands in a way that would possibly lead them to the Lord, that has to be a daily filling by Jesus, because like I said, it's in the dailiness where it really fleshes itself out.
Do you have anything to add to that, just from a man's perspective, a husband's perspective?
Yeah, and also honestly from a pastor perspective. So the verse says wives in the same way. And there's that phrase in the same way, and that actually goes back to verse 2, and it talks about in the same way that we kind of honor God before, kind of honoring God. And it's that same type of in the same way. You see that phrase a couple times. But this verse, I mean, I think it's important just for men to understand, like, this is written to wives, and it's helpful, I think, to understand that, because really there shouldn't ever be a time where a husband like lords this over a wife and says, see, right here it says this. Like, that's not even written to a man. Like, you could ignore that part and go on to the part that addresses you. Or there's similar verses in Ephesians chapter 5, and there's a couple commandments to men, to love your wife as Christ loved the church. That is your role. Your role is not to point to that and say, make my dinner, do my laundry, we're going here or there. So.
Yeah. And so Mom kind of touched on the idea of women who are married to men who are not following the Lord, or not with the same passion, but can this be applied to maybe men who are married to women who are not following the Lord with as much fervor? Yeah, I mean, I would say that the passage was written to women whose husbands were not following the Lord, because they were the wives were the first generation Christians, and the husbands hadn't met the Lord. And so Peter is saying, if your husband doesn't know the Lord, then here's how to win him to the Lord, or here's how to help him become more spiritual. But I do think that same principle can be taken in reverse, although in the sense of a husband is going to help to transform his wife spiritually and otherwise by the love that he shows her, not by outward adornment or by commanding her, telling her that she must do this or do that. Yeah.
And the part that really stands out to me is to be won over without words by the behavior of how we live. And I think that's profound in the sense that so often we want to put words to the way that or the choices that we make, or the way that we're living, but the idea is winning our spouse over without words, because we want to live differently. And I think so much of following Christ is really learning to love people better. And sometimes that's learning to love the hard to love. And sometimes that might be our spouse.
Yeah. So, yeah. And then I think maybe another stumbling block or roadblock in this passage is it refers to women as the weaker vessel. And I think in the culture that we're in and the circles that we're in, that's considered offensive, not politically correct. So kind of what is maybe your response that you would have to people who kind of push back on that, especially because in this relationship, one of us does boot camp every day.
Right.
The other one does not.
Yes. Yes. So, I don't think we want to take this in the literal sense, because I think Stacy could take me with her boot camp experience and all that. But here's what's interesting about this passage is, I think in our culture we read this, and women can sometimes bristle at that and go, I'm not comfortable with that. And I think that's a pretty natural reaction. But what I think is very interesting is when this was first written, it wasn't most likely the women that bristled at this, it was the men that bristled at this. Because as it talks about here, it says husbands in the same way, so there's that phrase again. Consider your, be considerate as you live with your wives, treat them with respect as the weaker vessel. And then it talks about as heirs or co-heirs with Christ. And at this time, like in that culture, like men were here and women were significantly below in terms of just status and social order and all that kind of stuff. And so when Peter writes this, he's saying he's elevating women to the same level as men, as being co-heirs with Christ. And so when it says the weaker vessel, he's talking about treat them with love and care and fragileness in that sense. He's not saying demean them at all. He's actually doing the opposite. He's saying this is something incredibly valuable. So care for the same way that if you had like a really valuable, Picasso pot, you would treat that special. And that's what Peter is saying. And so it's just a little bit interesting, kind of the cultural lens that we see this through and the way they saw that through.
And the next question I have really ties in well with that, but it talks about this idea of honoring and respecting. So what does that look like on a practical action level, in the day-to-day in your marriage?
Well, I would say one of the things that we have really held on to as kind of our marriage verse, would you say, or marriage motto, is where it talks in Philippians about if you have been united in Christ, if you have any encouragement from his love, then be united in spirit and purpose. And the way that we do that is by what Paul says in Philippians is the idea of not putting yourself above your spouse, that you don't do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit, but in humility consider others better than yourselves. Look not only to your own interest, but to the interests of others. And I would say that we have definitely put that into practice and found that that's almost the key to our marriage, is the idea that I can trust Matt to know that he is putting my needs above his own, and he likewise can trust me that I'm putting his needs above my own. And to me, that trust is really the key to what makes our marriage work. And that to me is the daily choice of honoring and respecting, is putting his needs above mine.
Yeah. And the only thing I'd add to that is, in theory, when Philippians 2 works, the fight is not like, let's do it my way. The fight is, you go first, no, you go first, no, you go first. And that, it doesn't always work like that in our marriage, and marriages, it doesn't always work. But that's the ideal of saying, I'm going to put the other person's need first and trust that he or she will put my needs first.
So you were talking about the verse about put others' needs before your own, and I remember you had us also memorize that verse for countless Sundays in a row. We had to tell you that verse, and you'd always make us repeat it whenever we were arguing. But
that's because you and your brother didn't do that, probably.
Brother and brother. I was perfect.
That's true.
That's why I'm doing this interview. But that kind of ties in the next thing I had of how do you see your marriage affecting the way that you parent, both your biological kids and your non-biological kids?
Yeah. So, I said a little bit earlier, I think this has probably been the biggest point of tension in our marriage. So our youngest biological child, Ben, is 15, and then we got an 8-year-old, and it was the first week was really hard for me, and I think for Stacy too, but maybe harder for me. It's there was he lived such kind of a wild, crazy life, and then we were trying to just teach him rules and boundaries and all that kind of stuff, and Stacy was really good and consistent about that, but it was also hard because I wanted to have fun and overlook things and that kind of thing, and so it made me realize it's gosh, we got to go back and figure out what does it look like to raise an 8-year-old, because we haven't had an 8-year-old for 7 years, and we raised that one till he was from 0 to 8, and it's this is hard. We've traded in a really nice life for some difficulty. What have we done?
I think I would say that we parent with the end in mind, if that makes sense. That we look at really the goal of having our kids be lifelong followers of Christ, of owning their own faith and finding joy and abundance in that. And so I think we have always prioritized relationship over rules. And so I think that kind of comes, prioritizing a relationship is very true of our marriage as well. And so I think that's how it's kind of overflowed into our parenting, that we also want, this is really our goal, is that we want our kids to come home at Christmas. Like, we want to be the family that they choose when they're married. So the idea that we really want to win our kids' hearts and have that relationship, which we are so enjoying with our adult children now. So.
Yeah, so that's the goal, but how you get there, that's where the conflict sometimes comes in, because yes, we value relationships over rules, but there has to be rules. And so which rules foster how much do you, so there's been a lot of conversations that we've had trying to figure that out and work that through. And again, I think it's about valuing that God put both of us as the parents, not one of us. Because if the kids were all parented, if Stacy parented just like me, or I parented just like Stacy, I think our kids would be a mess. But I think because there's a complement to each other, they're slightly better than it would be.
Yeah, slightly better. So this fall, our whole church is doing kind of this series or challenge on persevering. So what would your advice or insight be to people who maybe feel like they are in a season of marriage where it's just persevering, like it is a survival and not a thriving at all? So kind of what advice or insight do you have to that? And then also, is there a season where you felt like your marriage was just persevering?
Well, I'll answer the first part. You want to answer the second part?
Okay.
Yeah. So I would say, if you are in a place where you're persevering in your marriage, like, that's hard because you're around your spouse like so much, and it's just, I feel for people like that. That not every marriage is life-giving, not every season of marriage is good, and there's times to persevere, and it's just hard. But I guess probably the thing that I would come back to is that your identity is in Christ. And that's where you derive your joy and your contentment, your satisfaction and your filling. And if you are receiving that from Christ and your relationship with Christ, it's much easier to endure the pain of a difficult relationship or a difficult season in a relationship. Because if you are expecting your spouse, your husband, your wife, to fulfill you or to make you happy or to give you joy, then it's just too much pressure, too much expectation, and you'll be doubly hurt. And so I think if you can take that from Christ and be filled with Christ, you're able to pour out into your husband, your wife, and kind of do what the passage says. If you're being filled up by Christ, then you can love the other person sacrificially. It's not easy, but I think there is a path through as you're filled by God, and then love your spouse well, that it begins to become a good cycle in a marriage instead of a destructive cycle in a marriage.
Well, and I would speak to that as well. I think women especially want to change their spouses. And I think when we look at maybe one of our spouse who is not following Christ with the same fervor, like you said, as we are, that we want to change them so that our family looks like this, our marriage looks like this, our parenting looks like this, as opposed to, I want what's best for my husband. I want him to have a vibrant, flourishing, growing relationship with Christ for his sake alone. And so I think I'm going to shout out to my friend who mentioned this quote at Bible study on Thursday. She said that unmet expectations lead to a life of disappointment. And when our expectation is that our husband would change, then guess what? It's probably going to be unmet because they don't, fit the picture that we designed in our minds for them to live. And so really the idea of honoring and respecting and living our lives in front of our husband, just so that they would see the delight that comes from our relationship with Christ, rather than wanting them to change to fit our expectation.
And then what would you say, the other part of the question was like, what was there a point in our marriage where you felt you had to persevere more?
Yes, I just feel like raising young children. I mean, that's where you just have to prioritize marriage over kids. So it's just it's a constant tension of how to balance. And so I feel like for me and maybe for us, when our kids were all little, that was persevering.
Yeah. We just, I remember times where we would just go to bed exhausted, and probably more Stacy, she was doing the lion's share of parenting the kids. And so, I get home and then she'd put the kids to bed and I'd be like, hey, and she'd be like, and, and there was, some tension there or whatever, but that was probably a hard season of life because you're just so physically exhausted.
Yeah. And then when your kids grow up, you get emotionally exhausted. So that's super fun too.
That's true.
So what did it look like to prioritize your marriage in those seasons, of raising young kids? Or how are you intentionally building into one another and prioritizing that?
Yeah, so one of the things that we have kind of kept all throughout our marriage, and we really kind of needed to do it, especially when you guys were little, is that we made sure that we had a daily time of 10 or 15 minutes where it was just us, and so we'd sit on the couch when I got home and we'd, put you guys, the kids, in front of a movie or whatever it was, or make sure you're playing it like, hey, this is our time, and just, that 15 or 20 minutes of connection. And then at that point in time, we really also needed to just have a date night. And so we had a budget category of babysitting money, and then we would go out for a date, and that, hour and a half, 2 hours was really helpful for us to make sure we connected on a fun sort of level. And it's interesting having, so when our kids got older, we going out on dates and time by ourselves was a lot easier. But now that we've added 2 more kids into the family, it's a little bit harder. And so we're like, we got to institute date night again. This is killing me. You know what I mean? And so
Emily to the rescue on Friday night.
Yes.
Now you have 3 babies a day.
That's free date night.
That's right.
Yeah.
We don't need that cash envelope.
Yes, exactly. And so what are maybe just a few key things or ideas or concepts or applications that you would want married people to take from this to build a successful relationship and companionship?
We both already spoken to it, but the idea of daily filling by Jesus, that really is where we get our needs met and where we find our joy and delight. And that is really non-negotiable for both of us. And so I would say that making Christ our highest priority would be really the first key for me.
Yeah, I would agree. And I would probably say the second key is prioritize the relationship between the husband and the wife above all things, and there was a time early in our marriage, and I was doing ministry, and the ministry was important to me, and it was important to Stacy too. But I can remember saying to Stacy, you need to feel more important than the ministry. You always are, and you know that you are, but her feelings are important. You need to feel, and I think that's true. More of a generic husbands and wives and stereotyping a little bit, but I think the wife needs to feel more important than the husband's job. She is, but she needs to feel more important, and the husband needs to feel more important than the wife's job,
or the wife's children,
or the wife's children.
Yeah, I think that was the question that I allowed you to ask me. Do I feel more important than our kids?
Yeah. And allowing feelings to be a barometer of how the relationship is going.
Yeah. And then for the single people, if they have made it through this video up until this point, I'm not sure if they did.
We should have started that first.
We should have started with them, and then they could have signed out. But so what counsel would you have for those people? Maybe people who wish that they were married or want to be married in the near future. What insight would you have for them in this season?
I would say for single friends and my single children that recognizing that God has you in this season for a purpose, and the idea of continuing to run your race with him, getting closer and closer to him, conforming more and more to his likeness. And then it's almost like a visual picture of you running your race and then kind of looking over and seeing someone of the opposite sex who might be running with the same kind of fervor.
You know, the other thing that I would say is the idea of like, don't compromise. I would say that to men, to women, don't compromise just because you want to get married. And I would say that both of us have interacted with a lot of people who compromised, and then they're like, I'm kind of stuck. Now, by the same token, like, don't compromise, but also remember, like, Jesus is not available, right? So you can't marry Jesus, but at the same time, don't compromise, but you don't have to look for perfection. The other thing that I would say is or the other counsel I'd have to single people is there is a phenomenal sermon series and then also a book by Andy Stanley called The New Rules for Love, Sex, and Dating. And I would say, like, I feel like that is the best sermon series on anything of any topic. Like, it is that good. And I feel like every single person, probably 16 and above, should either watch that or read that book because it's just incredibly, incredibly helpful. So that'd be my other counsel to single people.
Yeah, that's great. Good stuff. So that is all the questions that I have. Is there anything else that you want to touch on that we didn't get to? You know, little tidbits, tricks, etc.
Well, let me tell you, Riley, Will, and Ben. No, this has been really fun. Thank you for doing this.
Yeah.
So, well, let me close in a word of prayer. All right. God, thanks so much for this time together, this interview, this conversation. And Lord, I do pray for all the husbands and wives who will watch this. Lord, I pray that you would bless their marriages and bless their relationships individually with you. And God, I pray that we will be able to put into practice the things from 1 Peter and just good wisdom about marriage from your word. Thank you for giving us a blueprint and a roadmap for marriage. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen.